May 19, 1945, Berlin, Germany. The sky hung low and grey over the ruined city as 28-year-old Margaret Weber swept broken glass from the doorway of what remained of her family's bakery on Frankfurter Allee. The once proud capital now lay in ruins, its grand boulevards transformed into canyons of rubble. Just 12 days earlier, the German forces had surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, ending the European phase of the conflict. Margaret, like many Berliners, had spent the final weeks of fighting hiding in cellars, surviving on stale bread and hope that was growing thinner by the day. She believed, as she had been told countless times, that American soldiers were brutal, vengeful men who would bring nothing but further suffering to the already devastated German population. Little did she know that within hours, her deeply held beliefs would begin a transformation that would challenge everything she had been taught to believe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a small group of African-American soldiers from the 761st Tank Battalion arrived in Berlin in the final days of Allied occupation zoning, and through unexpected acts of compassion and humanity, changed the course of relations between occupiers and occupied in one corner of a broken city, revealing how propaganda crumbles when confronted with genuine human connection. The air smelled of dust and defeat as Margaret worked. The steady rhythm of her broom against the cobblestones was interrupted by the distant rumble of military vehicles. Her shoulders tensed. The Americans were coming to their sector today. Berlin had been divided among the four major Allied powers: the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. The Soviets had captured the city, but according to pre-arranged agreements, American forces would be taking control of what would become the American sector of the city. "They will be here by midday," said Friedrich Hoffmann, the elderly watchmaker from across the street. His spectacles sat crookedly on his nose, one lens cracked from the final bombardment. "The first American units are already at Tempelhof." Margaret nodded grimly. "We should close the shutters and stay inside," she said, voicing what most residents had agreed upon. The rumors had spread rapidly, terrible stories of what happened when American forces entered towns and cities across Germany. The propaganda newspapers and radio broadcasts of the previous years had painted vivid pictures of barbaric American soldiers, especially emphasizing that many were black, described in terms so dehumanizing that Margaret had never questioned their truth. "They say there are colored troops among them," whispered Frau Schmidt, who had appeared from her half-collapsed apartment building, clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders despite the mild spring air. At 67, she had lived through the Great War and now this even greater catastrophe. The papers always said they were the worst of all. Lieutenant James Washington of the 761st Tank Battalion checked his watch as the convoy approached the southeastern edge of Berlin. At 25 years old, he had already seen enough combat and destruction to last several lifetimes. The 761st was one of the few African-American armored units that had seen extensive combat during the war. They had fought their way across France and into Germany, facing not only the enemy, but also the persistent racism within the American military itself. 10 minutes to the checkpoint, sir," reported Sergeant Marcus Williams from the driver's seat of the lead jeep. Behind them rolled 3 Sherman tanks and a column of transport trucks carrying supplies and additional personnel from their unit. "Remember what Colonel Davis said," Washington told the men within earshot. "We're representatives now. Every move we make will be watched and judged." Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, the famed Tuskegee Airmen, had addressed several black units before they entered occupation duty. His words still resonated with Washington. "Your conduct will determine how history remembers, not just you as soldiers, but all people of color in uniform." Washington knew the significance of their assignment. The 761st, along with elements of the 366th Infantry Regiment, another African-American unit, would be among the first American troops to establish a presence in certain neighborhoods of what would become the American sector. It was both an honor and an immense responsibility. "I hear the locals are terrified of us," said Corporal Henry Jackson, a former schoolteacher from Detroit who now served as the battalion's supply coordinator. The German propaganda about black American soldiers was apparently quite creative. Washington nodded grimly. That's putting it mildly. According to intelligence, they were told we were barely civilized, that we would... He stopped himself. The lies were too absurd, too painful to repeat. What German propaganda had claimed about African American soldiers went beyond the already vicious racist stereotypes common in America. Joseph Goebbels, the German propaganda minister, had specifically targeted the deployment of black American troops in his messaging, describing them as savage, animalistic, and unable to control their base instincts, implying that no German woman would be safe. These messages had been delivered through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and even special information sessions for the civilian population. "Doesn't matter what they believe," said Sergeant Williams as he navigated around a massive crater in the road. "They'll learn the truth soon enough." Washington wasn't so certain. Fear and prejudice were powerful forces. He had experienced enough of both in his home country to know they didn't dissolve easily upon contact with reality. The convoy slowed as they approached their designated area, a neighborhood centered around Frankfurter Allee that had once been a bustling commercial district. Now it resembled a mouthful of broken teeth, with only a few buildings standing intact among the rubble. "My God," muttered Corporal Jackson, "it's even worse than Leipzig." Washington had seen the destruction across Europe, but Berlin represented something different. This was the heart of the regime that had plunged the world into unprecedented conflict. Yet, looking at the hollow-eyed civilians picking through the ruins, he didn't feel the satisfaction he had expected. These were not the architects of aggression, but ordinary people caught in the machinery of history. At 42 years old, Helga Müller considered herself fortunate. Her apartment building on Frankfurter Allee had survived relatively intact, despite the heavy bombardment that had reduced neighboring blocks to rubble. A former secretary at a government office, she now found herself the de facto leader of the small community of survivors in her building. Her husband had not returned from the Eastern Front, and she had received no official notification of his fate. Still, she maintained a quiet dignity that commanded respect from her neighbors. "They're coming," announced 15-year-old Otto Becker, running up the stairs 2 at a time. The boy had appointed himself the neighborhood lookout, his youth allowing him an enthusiasm that adults could no longer muster. "American vehicles at the checkpoint. Some of the soldiers are Negroes." The word sent a ripple of anxiety through the small group gathered in the hallway. Helga saw the fear in their eyes, fear deliberately cultivated by years of propaganda. "Remember what we discussed," she said firmly. "We stay inside, we avoid contact, we give them no reason to notice us." The residents nodded in agreement. Among them was Margaret Weber, who had rushed home after hearing the distant engines of the American convoy. "But what about food?" asked Anna Richter, a young mother of twin girls aged 7. Her husband had been among the last conscripts thrown into the hopeless defense of Berlin. "We have almost nothing left." "We will manage," said Helga, though she knew their situation was desperate. The Soviet troops who had first captured Berlin had taken much of the remaining food supplies. What little remained was being carefully rationed among the residents, with priority given to the children. None of them had eaten a full meal in weeks. The sound of engines grew louder, then stopped. Heavy doors slammed, followed by voices speaking in English. The Americans had arrived. Lieutenant Washington established his command post in what had once been a restaurant. The large front windows were gone, but the structure itself was sound. Maps were spread across tables as his men secured the perimeter and began unloading supplies. "Sir, you should see this," said Corporal Jackson, returning from his initial survey of the area. "The civilians are hiding. Every building we've checked, people are cowering inside like they expect us to break down their doors." Washington frowned. "Any hostility?" "No, sir. Just fear. Lots of it. And hunger. These people are starving." Washington stepped outside and looked up and down the street. It was eerily empty for midday, in what should have been a populated area. Behind curtains and shutters, he could sense eyes watching, evaluating, judging. "Sergeant Williams," he called, "what's our food situation?" "Standard occupation rations, sir. We're well supplied for our unit." Washington made a decision that would alter the course of relations in this small corner of occupied Berlin. Prepare food packages from our supplies, basic staples, flour, sugar, coffee, canned goods, enough for each identified household in our immediate area. Williams hesitated. Sir, those are our rations. And we'll get resupplied. These people won't, Washington replied. Make it happen. Within an hour, small packages of American Army rations had been prepared. Washington addressed the men who would deliver them. You will approach each building, knock politely, and offer these supplies as a gesture of goodwill. You will not enter any residence unless specifically invited. You will behave with the utmost professionalism. Remember that you represent not only the United States Army, but also people of color in uniform. Any questions? There were none. The men understood the significance of what they were doing. Corporal Jackson led a team to the apartment building, where Helga Müller and the other residents waited anxiously. When the knock came at the front entrance, no one moved to answer it. We should ignore them, whispered Frau Schmidt. Helga shook her head. That would be more dangerous. With a deep breath, she straightened her threadbare dress and moved toward the door. Margaret Weber impulsively stepped forward to accompany her, unwilling to let the older woman face potential danger alone. The door opened to reveal Corporal Jackson and Private First Class Samuel Lewis standing on the steps. Both wore standard U.S. Army uniforms and carried small packages. Good afternoon, Jackson said in carefully practiced German. We are here to provide assistance, food supplies. He held out one of the packages. Helga and Margaret stared in stunned silence. This was not what years of propaganda had prepared them for. The men before them were not behaving as the mindless savages they had been described as, but as disciplined soldiers offering help. Helga found her voice first. Thank you, she said cautiously, accepting the package. The weight of it, real food, nearly brought tears to her eyes. Jackson nodded respectfully. We will bring more tomorrow. Please inform your neighbors that medical assistance is also available at our command post if needed. As the soldiers turned to move on to the next building, Margaret blurted out, Why are you helping us? Jackson paused, considering the young woman's question. Because you're hungry, he said simply, and we have food. The food distribution continued throughout the afternoon. Word spread quickly among the residents, and the initial terror began to give way to cautious curiosity. By evening, a few brave souls had ventured out to observe the American soldiers setting up their positions. In her apartment, Helga Müller opened the package of rations with Anna Richter and her twins, Margarete Weber and several other neighbors. There was flour, sugar, coffee, canned meat, and even chocolate, luxuries they hadn't seen in years. Anna's daughters stared wide-eyed at the chocolate bars, almost afraid to believe they were real. It could be a trick, said Frau Schmidt, voicing what some still feared. What kind of trick includes giving starving people food? Countered Margaret, who had been deeply affected by her brief encounter with Corporal Jackson. Nothing about him had matched the monstrous images from the propaganda posters. We should be practical, said Helga, always the voice of reason. We need this food. The children especially need it. She broke off a small piece of chocolate for each of the twins, whose expressions of delight brought smiles to the tired faces of the adults. That night, as Lieutenant Washington wrote his daily report, he noted that initial contact with the local population had been established without incident. What he couldn't know was that across the apartment buildings on Frankfurter Alley, the conversation had shifted from fear of the Americans to cautious assessment, and in some cases, like Margaret Weber's, to outright questioning of everything they had been led to believe. Dawn broke over Berlin with the sound of military vehicles and the movement of troops as more American forces arrived to establish their occupation zone. Lieutenant Washington stood outside the command post, watching as his men continued their patrols. The street was no longer empty. Small groups of civilians moved about, still giving the American soldiers a wide berth, but no longer hiding at the sight of them. Progress, observed Sergeant Williams as he joined Washington. Slow, but it's something. Food diplomacy works wonders, Washington replied with a slight smile. Any issues to report? Nothing significant, sir, though we did have an unexpected visitor at the medical station. Elderly German woman with a sick grandchild. Dr. Peterson treated the boy for bronchitis. This was unexpected, a German civilian voluntarily approaching American troops, especially black soldiers, for medical help. It represented a significant crack in the wall of fear and suspicion. By midday, more such cracks had appeared. A group of German men, former municipal workers, approached Corporal Jackson with an offer to help clear rubble from the main street to allow better movement of vehicles. Their spokesman, Friedrich Hoffmann, the watchmaker, explained that they wanted to contribute to restoring some normalcy to their neighborhood. Washington approved the cooperation, assigning several of his men to work alongside the Germans. The joint effort created the first real interaction between the occupiers and the occupied, as they worked together to move fallen masonry and clear debris. Observing from the doorway of her family's bakery, Margaret Weber watched this unexpected cooperation with growing interest. The American soldiers she saw laughing and joking as they worked alongside German civilians were nothing like the inhuman caricatures she had been shown in countless propaganda films and posters. Making a sudden decision, she returned to her apartment and retrieved a carefully hoarded treasure, a small amount of pre-war coffee she had saved for some unspecified special occasion. She brewed it using water heated on a small spirit stove, one of the few luxuries that had survived the bombardment. With trembling hands, she filled a flask and carried it out to where the men were working. The activity momentarily stopped as both Germans and Americans watched her approach. Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment, but pressed forward, offering the flask first to Friedrich Hoffmann and then to Corporal Jackson. "Coffee," she said simply, "real coffee, for those who are helping." The gesture was small but powerful. Coffee, especially good pre-war coffee, was a precious commodity in devastated Berlin. By sharing it with both her fellow Germans and the American soldiers, Margaret was making a profound statement about her changing perspective. Jackson accepted the flask with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Ma'am," he said, using the formal address he would have given to a respected woman back home in Detroit. The respect in his voice was unmistakable, and it further challenged the narrative Margaret had been fed for years. As the flask was passed among the workers, a small but significant barrier dissolved. Words were exchanged, halting German from the Americans, broken English from the Germans. But more important was the shared experience, the appreciation of a warm drink on a cool morning, the satisfaction of collaborative work, the universal language of nods and smiles that transcended linguistic boundaries. By late afternoon, more residents had emerged from their homes. Children, always the quickest to adapt, were the first to openly approach the American soldiers, drawn by their unfamiliar uniforms, equipment, and especially the occasional treat offered by homesick soldiers who missed their own children. Anna Richter's twins, Lotta and Liesel, were among these children. Initially held back by their cautious mother, they eventually broke free and ran to where Private Lewis was distributing small chocolate rations to a growing group of German children. "Anna, wait," called Anna, but it was too late. Her daughters had already joined the informal gathering. Rather than the feared outcome, Hannah watched as Private Lewis knelt to ensure even the smallest children got their share. His gentle manner with the children, the way he made sure each received equal treatment, stood in stark contrast to everything she had been told to expect from American soldiers, particularly black soldiers. When Lotta returned to her mother's side, clutching her precious piece of chocolate, she looked up with innocent wisdom. "Mutti, the radio lied about the Americans, didn't it?" From such simple observations, the greater unraveling began. Lieutenant James Washington was a thorough man. Before assuming his command in Berlin, he had studied what German propaganda had said about African-American soldiers. The lies had been vicious and dehumanizing, designed to instill terror in the German population at the thought of black occupiers. But Washington had also studied psychology at Howard University before the war, and he understood that the most effective way to combat such deeply ingrained prejudice was not through force or authority, but through consistent demonstration of its falsity. "Our greatest weapon against their propaganda," he told his officers that evening, "is our dignity. Every act of professionalism, every demonstration of restraint, every moment of kindness directly contradicts what they were told to expect from us." The officers nodded in agreement. Many of them had faced discrimination and prejudice in America. They were sadly familiar with being prejudged based on the color of their skin. Now, ironically, they found themselves in a position to challenge similar prejudices in a foreign land. "We received word today," Washington continued, "that our unit will be stationed here for at least 4 weeks during the initial occupation phase. That gives us time to make a genuine difference in how these people perceive not just American forces, but people of color in positions of authority." Across the street, in Helga Müller's apartment, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Several residents of the building had gathered to discuss their changing situation. "They are nothing like what we were told," said Margaret Weber emphatically. "Today I watched them working alongside Friedrich and the others, sharing the labor equally. They were respectful, disciplined. One of them treated my neighbor's son," added another woman. "A real doctor, gentle with the child. He gave medicine that has already improved the boy's breathing." Frau Schmidt, the eldest among them, remained skeptical. "Perhaps this is their strategy, to appear benevolent at first, then what?" interrupted Margaret. "They have all the power already. They control the food, the medicine, the weapons. If they wish to harm us, why would they need this elaborate deception?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable by those who still clung to their programmed fears. Helga Müller, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "I believe we must accept the evidence before our eyes rather than hold on to what we were told by those who led our country into ruin." Her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Those in power lied about many things. Why should this be different? This simple but profound observation resonated with many in the room. The same authorities who had promised 1,000-year glory had delivered instead total devastation. The same voices that had guaranteed victory had fled the city before the final defeat. Why indeed should their characterizations of the enemy be trusted? As the meeting dispersed, Margaret lingered to speak privately with Helga. "I am thinking of reopening the bakery," she said hesitantly. "Not fully. We don't have enough supplies for that. But perhaps we could use the oven to bake bread from the flour the Americans distributed. Share it among the neighbors." Helga considered this. "The bakery ovens still work?" "The back ones do. The main shop was damaged, but my father built the ovens to last." There was pride in Margaret's voice as she spoke of her father, currently in an Allied prisoner of war camp somewhere in France. The bakery had been his life's work. "I think it would be good," Helga said carefully, "for all of us to see something producing again rather than only destroying." The next morning, for the first time since the final bombardment of Berlin, smoke rose from the chimney of Weber's bakery. Using the American-provided flour and her family's closely guarded starter culture that had somehow survived the conflict, Margaret had begun baking bread. The aroma of fresh bread, a scent associated with normality, with life before the war, drifted along Frankfurter Allee. It drew people from their apartments and shelters, following their noses to the source of this nearly forgotten pleasure. Among those drawn by the scent was Corporal Henry Jackson, who found himself standing outside the bakery, inhaling deeply. The smell reminded him powerfully of his mother's kitchen in Detroit, of Sunday mornings before church, of a world that seemed increasingly distant. Inside, Margaret was shaping the last of the dough when she noticed the American soldier standing outside. After a moment's hesitation, she went to the door. "Would you like some bread?" she asked in her limited English. "It is not much, but it is fresh." Jackson removed his helmet, a gesture of respect. "Yes, ma'am, that would be very kind." Margaret invited him inside, where the warmth of the ovens created an atmosphere of comfort that had been absent from Berlin for many months. She cut a slice from a fresh loaf, offering it to him with a shy smile. "This is wonderful," Jackson said after the first bite. "Reminds me of home." Margaret's knowledge of English wasn't sufficient to fully understand, but the expression on his face communicated clearly. Food, she was rediscovering, spoke a universal language. "You have family? At home?" she asked haltingly. Jackson nodded, reaching for his wallet. He carefully removed a photograph showing a woman holding a baby. "My wife, Ruth, our son, Henry Jr. He was born while I was overseas. I've never met him." The humanity of this revelation, this black American soldier as a husband, a father separated from a child he had never held, further dismantled the dehumanized image Margaret had been given of these men. He was not an abstract enemy or a propaganda caricature, but a father longing for his son, a man with a life interrupted by war just as hers had been. Word of the bakery's reopening spread quickly through the neighborhood. By midday, most of the first batch of bread had been distributed among the residents, with Margaret insisting that families with children receive priority. The simple act of breaking bread together, of sharing this basic sustenance, became a powerful ritual of reconnection among the fractured community. Lieutenant Washington heard about the bakery from Jackson and recognized its significance immediately. Here was an opportunity for meaningful engagement that went beyond the mere distribution of supplies. "Arrange to provide additional flour and yeast from our stores," he instructed. "If they can establish regular bread production, it creates a sustainable improvement rather than temporary relief." This approach reflected Washington's broader philosophy about their occupation duties. He had seen how the harsh treatment of civilians in some liberated areas had created lasting resentment. By contrast, he believed that helping the local population rebuild some semblance of normal life would not only fulfill their humanitarian obligations, but also serve the strategic goal of a stable, cooperative occupation. The following day, Sergeant Williams delivered several sacks of flour and packages of yeast to the bakery. Margaret was overwhelmed by the generosity. "This is too much," she protested. "We cannot accept so much without payment." "Consider it an investment in the neighborhood," Williams explained through Friedrich Hoffmann, who had come to serve as an informal interpreter. "The lieutenant believes a functioning bakery serves everyone's interests." The concept of mutual benefit, rather than charity, helped Margaret accept the supplies with dignity rather than shame. By afternoon, she had organized a small group of women to assist with the expanded baking operation, transforming the bakery into an impromptu community center. Anna Richter proved particularly skilled at baking, revealing that she had worked in a hotel kitchen before marrying. Her twins became unofficial messengers, running between the bakery and apartment buildings to announce when fresh bread was ready. The routine gave purpose to their days that had been lacking since the conflict's end. As the bakery became established, an unexpected development occurred. German civilians began approaching Lieutenant Washington's command post with offers of skills and services. A former mechanic volunteered to help maintain American vehicles. A retired nurse offered assistance at the medical station. Even Friedrich Hoffmann contributed by repairing watches and clocks for both Germans and Americans. This emerging cooperation represented a dramatic shift from the fearful isolation of just days earlier. Each positive interaction further eroded the foundation of mistrust that years of propaganda had built. Not everyone embraced this changing relationship. Some residents remained aloof, viewing those who cooperated with the Americans as traitors. Others accepted American aid but maintained emotional distance, their national pride wounded by defeat and occupation. Kurt Braun, a former low-ranking member of the regime who had managed to avoid immediate arrest, became increasingly agitated by the growing rapport between the occupiers and his neighbors. From his apartment window, he watched with mounting anger as German women worked alongside African-American soldiers, distributing bread from the Weber bakery. "Have they no shame?" he muttered to himself. "No pride." In Braun's mind, this cooperation represented not survival or pragmatism, but capitulation and racial betrayal. The propaganda he had not only believed, but helped disseminate, was being disproven before his eyes, and rather than reconsidering his views, his resentment intensified. Braun began approaching neighbors, attempting to rekindle fear and suspicion of the American forces. "They're softening you up," he warned. "Don't be fooled by a few handouts." His efforts found little traction. The residents of Frankfurter Alley were making their judgments based on direct experience rather than second-hand claims. The concrete reality of food, medicine, and respectful treatment proved more compelling than abstract appeals to racial ideology or national pride. On the fifth day after the Americans' arrival, a significant event occurred that would accelerate the changing dynamics in the neighborhood. A Soviet patrol entered the area, having either misunderstood the occupation boundaries or deliberately testing them. 4 Soviet soldiers in a jeep drove down Frankfurter Allee, stopping near the bakery where a group of German women were distributing the day's bread with the assistance of Private Lewis. The tension was immediate and palpable. Relations between German civilians and Soviet troops had been extremely difficult during the initial capture of Berlin. Stories of looting and assault had spread throughout the city, creating terror among the population. The women froze as the Soviet soldiers approached, their expressions shifting from surprise to fear. Private Lewis, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, positioned himself between the women and the approaching Russians. Lieutenant Washington, alerted to the situation, arrived quickly with Sergeant Williams. He approached the Soviet officer with a formal salute. "This area is under American administration according to the agreed boundaries," Washington stated clearly, while Williams translated into rudimentary Russian. "We are responsible for the civilian population here." The Soviet lieutenant responded with his own explanation, which boiled down to a claim that they were pursuing black market operators who had fled into this district. Whether the excuse was genuine or fabricated, Washington maintained his professional demeanor. "We will handle any such investigations in our zone. I must ask you to respect the boundary agreements." The standoff continued for several tense minutes. The German civilians watched in shocked silence as an African-American officer firmly but respectfully stood his ground against Soviet forces, protecting Germans from Russians in a reversal of roles that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Eventually, the Soviet patrol withdrew, having made their point simply by their incursion. As they departed, Washington turned to find himself the center of attention from the gathered Germans, their expressions a mixture of relief and reassessment. For many of the witnesses, this incident represented the final demolition of their propaganda-instilled beliefs. These black American soldiers had not only treated them with unexpected humanity, but had now actively protected them from potential threat. The cognitive dissonance was too great to maintain their previous perceptions. That evening, Helga Müller requested a meeting with Lieutenant Washington. As the informal leader of the neighborhood residents, she came with a proposal. "We wish to formally establish a civilian committee to work with your forces," she explained, with Friedrich Hoffmann translating. "To coordinate between your administration and our people, to rebuild what can be rebuilt." Washington recognized the significance of this offer. It represented not just acceptance of American authority, but active partnership, something that would make their occupation duties both more effective and more humane. "I welcome your initiative," he responded. "Please assemble your committee. We will meet tomorrow to discuss how we can work together." As Helga left the command post, she passed Margaret Weber, who had come to deliver bread for the American soldiers. The older woman stopped briefly. "You were right," she said simply, "about everything." Margaret nodded, understanding the broader meaning beyond the simple words. They had all been right to question, to observe, to judge based on actions rather than propaganda. The lesson was one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. In his private quarters that night, Lieutenant Washington wrote in his journal, a practice he had maintained throughout his military service. His entry reflected both professional satisfaction and personal contemplation. 1 week in Berlin. Initial fear giving way to cautious cooperation. Our men performing admirably under circumstances that test not only their military discipline, but their personal restraint. Ironic that here, in the former capital of a regime built on racial hatred, we find ourselves dismantling prejudice through simple human decency. The weapons against their propaganda have been bread, medicine, and respect, proving more powerful than any counter-propaganda could have been. Yet I wonder about the deeper implications. These German civilians are learning that they were lied to about us. What else will they question about what they were told? And what responsibility do we bear in this unraveling of a worldview, however necessary that unraveling may be? The questions were profound, with no easy answers. But as the sounds of Berlin at night filtered through his window, the distant voices of civilians and soldiers mingling without the earlier tension, the occasional laughter of children who had found reasons to laugh again, Washington felt that whatever was unfolding here on Frankfurter Alley represented something meaningful amid the larger chaos of occupation. For Margarete Weber, standing in the doorway of her family's bakery as darkness fell over Berlin, the transformation of the past week had been both external and internal. The shop was functioning again, bringing life back to her corner of the devastated city. But more significantly, her understanding of the world had been fundamentally challenged. The enemy she had been taught to fear had brought food, medicine, and protection. The monsters from the propaganda posters had revealed themselves to be men with families, hopes, and basic human decency. As she secured the door for the night, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in a remaining shard of window glass. She looked different somehow, older perhaps, but also more certain. In the ruins of Berlin, amid the collapse of everything she had been raised to believe, she had found an unexpected truth. Humanity transcended the artificial boundaries that propaganda created. And that realization, simple yet profound, felt like the first real piece of solid ground beneath her feet since the bombs began to fall. 2 weeks after the arrival of the American forces, Frankfurter Allee had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. The streets were largely clear of rubble, with organized piles of salvageable building materials lined up for reuse. The Weber bakery now operated daily, with a rotation of neighborhood women working alongside Margaret to produce bread from the flour provided by the American quartermaster supplies. A small medical station operated from what had once been a tailor's shop, with American medics treating civilian ailments and injuries. Most notably, the atmosphere had changed from one of fearful hiding to cautious rebuilding. Lieutenant James Washington stood at the window of his command post, observing the morning activities. Children played in a small cleared area, under the watchful eyes of their mothers, no longer scurrying away at the sight of American uniforms. Elderly residents sat on salvaged chairs outside their buildings, soaking in the spring sunshine that seemed to promise renewal despite the devastation all around. "Quite a difference from when we arrived," remarked Corporal Henry Jackson, who had joined Washington at the window. "Hard to believe these are the same people who were hiding from us 2 weeks ago." Washington nodded thoughtfully. Fear can be dismantled, but it takes consistent evidence to the contrary. Every positive interaction builds another piece of trust. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Williams, who brought news that would significantly affect their operations. "Orders from headquarters, sir," he reported, handing over an official dispatch. "Division Command is reorganizing the occupation zones. Most of our unit is being reassigned to Steglitz District by the end of the week." Washington scanned the orders with growing concern. The 761st would be moved, with only a small detachment remaining in their current position until replacement troops arrived from the 204th Engineer Battalion, an all-white unit. "This could undermine everything we've accomplished here," Washington said quietly. "The transition needs to be handled carefully." Jackson understood immediately. "The locals have just started to trust us, specifically us. A new unit coming in, especially one without our experience in community relations." He left the implication hanging. Washington made a decision. "We'll organize a formal handover, introduce the incoming commanders to the civilian committee, make it clear that our policies regarding food distribution and medical support are to continue." He knew he was slightly overstepping his authority, but he felt responsible for the fragile peace they had established. "And we should inform Frau Müller and the other community leaders right away," added Jackson. "Give them time to prepare their people for the change." Washington agreed. Transparency had been a cornerstone of their approach, and maintaining it now was crucial. Across the street at Weber's bakery, Margaret was instructing Anna Richter in the art of sourdough cultivation. The bakery had become something of an unofficial community center, where neighborhood women gathered not just to work, but to exchange information and provide mutual support. "The starter must be fed daily," Margaret explained, showing Anna how to add flour and water to the bubbling mixture. "My father always said it's like a pet. It needs regular care." Anna laughed, a sound that had become more common as the immediate trauma of survival began to recede. "My daughters already have enough pets. They've adopted every stray cat in the neighborhood." The comfortable atmosphere was interrupted by the arrival of Helga Müller, whose expression immediately alerted the others that something significant had occurred. "The Americans are leaving," Helga announced without preamble. "Lieutenant Washington just informed me. Most of them will be gone by the end of the week." The news was met with stunned silence, followed by a rush of anxious questions. All of them? Who will replace them? What about our food supplies? Helga raised her hands for quiet. Not all at once. A small group will remain temporarily. Another American unit will take their place eventually. Lieutenant Washington has assured me that the arrangements for food distribution and medical care will continue. Despite these reassurances, an undercurrent of anxiety spread through the bakery. The women had adapted to the presence of Washington's men, had learned their names and habits, had built a tentative trust. Now they faced uncertainty once again. "Will the new soldiers be colored men also?" asked Frau Schmidt, voicing the question many were thinking but hesitant to ask. "No," replied Helga. "Lieutenant Washington said they are from an engineering battalion." She didn't need to specify further. Everyone understood the implication. Margaret set down the bowl of sourdough starter with deliberate care. "We should organize something," she said, "before they leave, to show appreciation for what they've done for us." The suggestion was met with thoughtful silence. The idea of Germans formally thanking American troops, especially African-American troops, represented a significant deviation from what anyone might have expected just weeks earlier. "What did you have in mind?" asked Helga. "A meal," Margaret suggested. "Not just bread, but a proper meal. We could use our rations, pool them together. With what they've provided us, we could make something special." The suggestion quickly gained support. After weeks of mere survival, the prospect of creating something celebratory, something that acknowledged human connection rather than just physical need, sparked enthusiasm among the women. Plans developed rapidly. Women from throughout the neighborhood volunteered items from their carefully hoarded supplies, spices saved through years of conflict, special dishes that had somehow survived the bombardment, family recipes preserved despite the chaos of war. What began as a simple suggestion evolved into a community-wide effort to create a meaningful farewell. Lieutenant Washington received the invitation with surprise and appreciation. The neighborhood women wished to host a dinner for our officers and senior enlisted men, Friedrich Hoffmann explained, serving as translator, to express gratitude before your unit's departure. Washington was moved by the gesture. "Please convey our acceptance and our honor at being invited." Throughout the following days, preparations intensified. The bakery operated at full capacity, with women taking shifts to produce not just standard bread, but special rolls and even simple cakes using carefully rationed sugar. Others worked to clean and decorate the former restaurant that now served as the American command post, transforming it as much as possible from a military facility into a dignified dining space. Margaret took particular responsibility for the main dishes. With Anna Richter's assistance, she adapted traditional German recipes to work with available ingredients, including American ration components that were unfamiliar but versatile. The challenge of creating a festive meal from the limited resources of a devastated city required both creativity and determination, qualities that had helped these women survive the final terrible months of the conflict. On the evening of the dinner, Lieutenant Washington addressed his men who would be attending. "This gesture from the civilian population is significant beyond the meal itself," he told them. "It represents a bridge built between people who were taught to fear and hate one another. Whatever else we have accomplished during our deployment, this human connection may be our most important achievement." The officers and senior non-commissioned officers, in their best uniforms, walked across Frankfurter Allee to what had been whimsically dubbed Café Berlin for the evening. The former restaurant had been transformed with tablecloths made from salvaged fabric, wildflowers gathered from the rubble-filled lots where nature had already begun the work of reclamation, and candles providing a warm glow that softened the visible signs of destruction. Helga Müller, serving as the unofficial hostess, greeted the American officers at the entrance. "Welcome," she said in carefully practiced English. "We are honored by your presence." Washington responded in his equally careful German, "The honor is ours." Inside, the other neighborhood women waited nervously. For most, this was their first social event since before the final battle for Berlin. They wore their least damaged clothes, and some had fashioned new garments from salvaged materials. Margaret Weber had repurposed an old curtain into a simple but elegant dress, while Anna Richter wore her carefully preserved wedding suit, altered to fit her now thinner frame. The evening began with an initial awkwardness, as both groups, American soldiers and German civilians, navigated this unprecedented social interaction. But as the first course was served, a soup made from American canned goods cleverly transformed with local herbs, the atmosphere began to relax. Friedrich Hoffmann, serving as both translator and informal master of ceremonies, facilitated conversation between the two groups. What emerged was not political discussion or even talk of the war, but the universal subjects that connect people across boundaries, stories of hometowns, of families, of hopes for peacetime lives. Corporal Jackson found himself deep in conversation with Margaret about baking techniques, with Friedrich translating their shared enthusiasm for proper bread making. Sergeant Williams discovered that Helga Müller had visited America before the war, spending 6 months in Chicago with distant relatives in 1936. The discovery of these small connections, these threads of shared humanity, continued throughout the evening. For dessert, the women had created a triumph of ingenuity, a cake made with precious rationed sugar, supplemented with dried fruits from American supplies, and topped with a thin layer of genuine chocolate that had been contributed by nearly everyone in the neighborhood, saving their small luxury rations for this special occasion. As the cake was served, Helga Müller rose to make a brief speech, which Friedrich translated into English. 2 weeks ago we waited in fear behind closed doors as you arrived on our street. We had been told you were our enemies, inhuman and dangerous. She paused, her eyes moving across the faces of the American officers. Instead, you brought food to our hungry children. You provided medicine for our sick. You treated us with a dignity we did not expect and, some might say, did not deserve after what our country has done. The room was silent as Friedrich carefully translated her words. We cannot change the past, Helga continued. We cannot undo the terrible events that have brought us all to this moment, but perhaps we can learn from them. Perhaps we can recognize that many of the divisions between us were created by those who sought power through hatred and fear. She raised her glass of water. There was no wine to be had in devastated Berlin. We thank you not just for the material aid you have provided, but for helping us see beyond the lies we were told. Whatever comes next in our occupied city, we will remember that our first Americans were men of honor and compassion. Lieutenant Washington stood to respond, his words measured and thoughtful. On behalf of my officers and men, I thank you for this remarkable evening. We came to Berlin as soldiers, following orders. We did not expect to find friends. He looked around the room, acknowledging the women who had created this evening from almost nothing. Yet friendship is what has grown here, born from the simple recognition of our shared humanity. He raised his own glass. May what has been built here, not the physical rebuilding of streets and buildings, but the bridges between people, continue long after we have departed. The toast was honored around the room, this simple ceremony marking a moment of connection that none present would forget. As the evening drew to a close, Margarete Weber approached Lieutenant Washington with a carefully wrapped package. For your journey, she said, as Friedrich translated, bread from our bakery, a remembrance. Washington accepted the gift with genuine appreciation, understanding its significance. In a city where food remained precious, this offering represented far more than mere sustenance. I will remember, he promised. The following morning brought the reality of the military redeployment. Trucks arrived to transport most of the 761st's personnel and equipment to their new assignment. The street filled with activity as soldiers loaded vehicles and prepared for departure. Lieutenant Washington oversaw the operation with his characteristic efficiency, but he also made time for a final meeting with the neighborhood committee that had been established under Helga Müller's leadership. Captain Thomas Hughes will command the detachment remaining here until the engineering battalion arrives, Washington explained. He understands the importance of continuing our established policies. Helga nodded. We will work with him as we have worked with you. I've also arranged for your neighborhood to receive priority for reconstruction materials, Washington added. The engineers coming in will be tasked with infrastructure repair. They should be able to help restore water and electricity to more buildings. This was welcome news. Basic utilities remained inconsistent throughout Berlin, with many areas still relying on communal water sources and having no electrical service. As the meeting concluded, Washington handed Helga an official document. This certifies your neighborhood committee as the recognized civilian authority for this sector, authorized to coordinate with military administration. The document bore the signatures of Washington and his superior officers. It will help ensure continuity when the new unit arrives. Helga accepted the document with solemn appreciation. You have given us back more than physical necessities. Lieutenant, you have helped restore our sense of agency in our own community. Outside, the neighborhood residents had gathered to witness the departure. Children who had initially hidden from the American soldiers now waved from windows and doorways. Elderly residents stood at attention, offering the dignified farewell of one generation of survivors to another. As Washington prepared to board the final vehicle, he noticed Margaret Weber standing slightly apart from the others. She had been one of the first to bridge the gap between occupiers and occupied, one of the first to question the propaganda she had been fed. Her journey from fear to understanding mirrored that of the entire neighborhood. Your bakery has become the heart of this community, Washington told her with Friedrich translating. That is an achievement as important as any military objective. Margaret smiled, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and newfound confidence. We will continue what has begun here, she replied, not just baking bread but breaking it together. With final salutes and handshakes, the main contingent of the 761st departed Frankfurter Allee, leaving behind a small detachment to maintain continuity until their replacements arrived. Sergeant Williams, seated beside Washington in the command jeep, glanced back at the diminishing view of the neighborhood. Do you think it will last, sir? What we started there? Washington considered the question carefully. The physical improvements will continue. The engineers will see to that. The food distribution systems we established should remain in place, at least for the foreseeable future. He paused. As for the changes in perception, in understanding, those are harder to predict. People can revert to old prejudices under stress or new propaganda. But some changes go too deep to be reversed, he added after a moment. When you've been taught to see someone as less than human, and then that person shares their food with your hungry child, offers medicine for your sick parent, treats you with consistent dignity, that creates a cognitive dissonance that can permanently alter your worldview. Williams nodded thoughtfully. Never thought I'd be changing German minds about race while they were changing my mind about Germans. Washington smiled at the observation. War creates enemies out of strangers. Peace, when done right, can transform enemies back into human beings. 3 days after the departure of Lieutenant Washington's unit, the advance elements of the 204th Engineer Battalion arrived on Frankfurter Allee. Captain Michael Donovan, commanding the new American forces, was met by the neighborhood committee, led by Helga Müller. Initial interactions were cautious on both sides. The engineers had different priorities than Washington's infantry unit, focusing on infrastructure assessment rather than community relations. Many of the soldiers seemed surprised by the level of cooperation from the local population, having been briefed to expect passive resistance at best and active hostility at worst. Your people seem almost friendly, Captain Donovan remarked to Helga during their first official meeting. That's not what we were told to expect in Berlin. Perhaps you should question your intelligence sources, Helga replied with gentle irony. We have learned to question ours. The transition proceeded with inevitable adjustments on both sides. The new American unit was less experienced in civilian affairs, more focused on their technical mission of rebuilding infrastructure. The remaining detachment from Washington's unit helped bridge the gap, explaining the systems that had been established and introducing the new commanders to key community members. At Weber's bakery, Margaret continued the daily bread production, now with a well-organized team of neighborhood women. The bakery remained a hub of community activity, a place where information was shared and problems discussed. One afternoon, a young lieutenant from the engineering battalion entered the bakery, curious about the operation he had heard mentioned by his men. Ma'am, he addressed Margaret with awkward formality. I'm Lieutenant Robert Clark. I've been assigned to assess buildings in this sector for structural integrity. Friedrich Hoffmann, who happened to be present, translated for Margaret. "Welcome, Lieutenant," she responded. "Would you like some bread? It is made with your American flour." The young officer seemed taken aback by the offer, but accepted a small loaf. As he looked around the busy bakery, his expression revealed his struggle to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had expected to find. "If I may ask," he said hesitantly, "how did this arrangement begin? Cooperation between your people and ours?" Margaret considered how to answer, knowing the complexity behind the simple question. "It began with hunger," she said finally, "and it continued with humanity." Lieutenant Clark didn't fully understand her meaning, but he sensed the significance behind her words. He departed with not just bread, but questions about the narrative he had been given regarding the German civilian population. In the weeks that followed, the patterns established during Washington's tenure gradually evolved. The engineering battalion, while less focused on community relations, brought critical technical skills that accelerated the physical rebuilding of the neighborhood. Water service was restored to most buildings, electrical lines were repaired, and assessments were made for more substantial reconstruction. The neighborhood committee, legitimized by Washington's official recognition, continued to serve as the bridge between military authorities and civilians. Helga Müller proved adept at navigating the bureaucracy of occupation, advocating for her community's needs, while maintaining cooperative relations with the rotating American personnel. For Margaret Weber, the bakery became more than a family business. It was her contribution to the rebuilding of something beyond mere structures. Each loaf of bread represented continuity, normality, the basic sustenance of community in both physical and metaphorical terms. 6 weeks after the departure of Lieutenant Washington's unit, an unexpected visitor arrived at the bakery. Private First Class Samuel Lewis, one of the soldiers from the 761st, appeared at the door in civilian clothes. "I've been discharged," he explained, with Friedrich translating, "heading home to South Carolina soon, but I wanted to see how things were going here before I left Germany." His visit caused excitement throughout the neighborhood. For many of the residents, the soldiers of the 761st had come to represent more than just the first American occupiers. They symbolized the beginning of recovery, the first step towards something resembling normal life amid the ruins. Lewis was amazed at the changes since his departure. "The street looks completely different," he remarked, "and there are so many more people out and about." "The engineers have been efficient," Margaret acknowledged, "but the spirit of rebuilding began with your unit." That evening, a small gathering was held at Helga Müller's apartment in Lewis's honor. Several of the neighborhood committee members attended, along with Friedrich Hoffmann and Margarete. It was a modest affair by pre-war standards, but represented luxury in still recovering Berlin. Coffee from American supplies, bread from the bakery, and even a small cake that Anna Richter had managed to create with carefully hoarded ingredients. As they shared this simple meal, the conversation turned to the broader changes occurring throughout Berlin and Germany as a whole. The division of the country into occupation zones was becoming more formalized, with increasing differences in approach between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Political reorganization was beginning, with new local governments forming under Allied supervision. The immense task of physical rebuilding continued alongside the more complex process of psychological and social reconstruction. "Before the war ended," Lewis said during a pause in the conversation, "I never imagined I'd be sitting in a Berlin apartment, having coffee with Germans as friends. And we never imagined we would welcome American soldiers, especially colored soldiers, as protectors rather than enemies," replied Helga. "The world has turned in unexpected ways." Lewis nodded thoughtfully. "When I get home, people will ask about Germany, about what it was like here after everything that happened." "What will you tell them?" asked Margaret. Lewis considered the question carefully. "I'll tell them that after all the fighting and dying, what mattered most wasn't who won or lost, but how we recognized each other's humanity when the shooting stopped." He looked around at the Germans who had welcomed him into their home. "I'll tell them that I found good people trying to rebuild from ruins, who were lied to just like so many others, and who want the same things my family wants back home: safety, purpose, community. This simple expression of human recognition across the divisions of nationality, race, and recent enmity touched everyone present. It represented the essence of what had been built in this small corner of occupied Berlin, not just physical reconstruction, but the rebuilding of human connection. As summer turned to autumn in Berlin in 1945, the patterns of occupation became more established. The American sector developed its own character, distinct from the British, French, and Soviet zones. Reconstruction continued at varying paces, affected by policy decisions made far from the streets, where ordinary Berliners struggled to rebuild their lives. On Frankfurter Allee, the neighborhood committee established by Helga Müller became a model for civilian-military cooperation, studied by occupation authorities seeking to improve relations throughout the American sector. The Weber Bakery, now operating with semi-regular supplies through official channels, served as both a practical food source and a symbol of community resilience. For Margaret Weber, the experiences of those first days after the Americans' arrival had permanently altered her understanding of the world. The collapse of propaganda-instilled beliefs had opened her mind to critical questioning of all she had been taught. She became known for her direct manner, her willingness to challenge authority when necessary, and her unwavering commitment to community-based solutions. In October, a letter arrived for Margaret, forwarded through multiple military postal channels. It was from Lieutenant Washington, now stationed in Frankfurt. "I trust this finds you and the neighborhood well," he wrote, with Friedrich later translating. "Our time in Berlin remains a significant memory for me and many of my men. We are scheduled to return to the United States next month, and I wish to express once more my appreciation for the connections formed during our service there. The bread from your bakery sustained more than just physical hunger. It nourished hope that a better world might emerge from the tragedy of war." Margaret kept the letter, a tangible reminder of the unexpected transformation that had occurred when fear gave way to human recognition. In later years, as Cold War tensions transformed Berlin into a symbol of global division, she would often reflect on those early days after the conflict's end, when different choices might have led to different outcomes. The story of what happened when Black American soldiers arrived in Berlin became part of the neighborhood's collective memory, passed down as an example of how propaganda can dissolve in the face of direct human experience. For the women of Frankfurter Allee, particularly those who had worked in the bakery during those pivotal weeks, it represented a lesson in questioning received wisdom and recognizing common humanity across manufactured divides. Helga Müller, who continued to lead the neighborhood committee until 1949, would later observe, "We were taught to fear these men because of the color of their skin. When they arrived, we discovered that all we had been told was false. This made us ask what else we had been told that was not true. For many of us, this questioning was the beginning of a different way of seeing the world, one based on observation rather than obedience. This transformation, from fear to recognition, from propaganda-instilled hatred to human connection, occurred in countless small interactions across divided Berlin in the aftermath of the conflict. While politicians drew lines on maps and military planners established occupation protocols, it was in these personal encounters that the real work of post-war reconstruction took place, the rebuilding not just of cities, but of human understanding. For the African-American soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion, their brief deployment to Berlin represented a complex irony. They had fought for freedom while facing discrimination within their own military, then found themselves in the position of bringing humanitarian aid to former enemies who had been taught to view them as racially inferior. Many, like Lieutenant Washington, would return to an America still struggling with its own racial divisions, carrying the perspective gained from their Berlin experience. As Berlin itself became the front line of a new global confrontation, with the Berlin Airlift of 1948 to 1949 and the eventual construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, the lessons of those early occupation days remained relevant. That propaganda cannot withstand direct human connection, that compassion can bridge seemingly insurmountable divides, and that breaking bread together, literally and figuratively, remains one of the most powerful acts of human reconciliation. In 1970, On the 25th anniversary of the end of the conflict in Europe, a journalist from an American newspaper visited Berlin to interview residents about their memories of the immediate post-war period. Among those he spoke with was Margaret Weber, now the owner of a successful bakery chain that had grown from that first tentative reopening in 1945. "What surprised you most about the American occupation?" the journalist asked. Margaret, her hair now grey but her gaze still direct and thoughtful, considered the question. "What surprised us most was discovering our own capacity for belief without evidence," she replied. "We had accepted what we were told about these men, that they were savages, barely human. When they arrived with food for our children, medicine for our sick, and respect for our dignity, we were forced to confront our own complicity in believing lies." "And what did you do with that realization?" the journalist asked. "We baked bread," Margaret said with a smile. "We baked bread, and we shared it. And in doing so, we began to rebuild not just our city, but ourselves." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.